Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. We have our first significant severe weather event on tap today in quite some time, as the SPC has outlined an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 in the orange shaded region here across the Gulf Coast states. That includes southeast Louisiana, southern Mississippi into southern Alabama, with a large slight and marginal risk surrounding that. This event has uptrended some in the last couple of days. A few days ago, SPC just had a low-end marginal risk out here, but there have been some signals that this may be a little bit more potent event than what was initially forecast, so the SPC has quickly bumped up those probabilities for today. The reason is for the potential for tornadoes, a few of which may be strong, especially in the yellow stippled region here. 10% hatched region for significant tornadoes is possible there from within the enhanced risk area, southeast Louisiana into southern Alabama, with a 2 and 5% area surrounding that. So the greatest threat for strong tornadoes does exist there from southeast Louisiana into southern Alabama. So that was not on the table a few days ago. Confidence has increased in the threat for significant tornadoes with this event today. Damaging winds also on the table for today. They are not significant damaging wind probabilities yet. They've not added a hatched area in, but we do have a 30% risk area in the red shading there from southeast Louisiana into far southwest Alabama. So a confined corridor where damaging winds could take place with this system as it moves across the Gulf Coast states today. And large hail not going to be a risk really at all, except a small area from southeast Louisiana into southern Alabama in the 5% brown shaded region there. So robust event on tap for today. Let's go ahead and dive into the data. Let's show you what is going on at the moment. This is our current radar imagery, and we have quite a bit of convection ongoing, showers and storms from far east Texas into Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama into Georgia. None of this is severe at this time. We will watch areas back to the west out here across East Texas into Louisiana in the upcoming hours, as this could be where our first round of more intense convective development occurs back along the frontal zone that is taking shape out to the west there. This could become surface-based later on into the late morning and early afternoon hours. So we'll have to watch this complex back in there, but the rest of this, just some elevated showers and storms well to the north of the main warm sector, which is lying down here across the far southern portion of the Gulf Coast states at this point. You can see where that is here on our visible satellite imagery. Interesting look here. You can see all of this cloud cover streaming out of the southwest. This is due to our lead shortwave, as well as all of this convection that is ongoing out ahead of the developing system out here to the west. You'll notice here, though, down to the south, we have kind of a demarcating boundary across far southern Mississippi, southern Louisiana, southern Alabama, where it is fairly clear down here. We have quite a bit of clearing that is occurring, moving in off the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, whatever you want to call it. And this frontal zone is going to be our demarcating boundary, our warm frontal zone, and how far north that shifts today is going to really dictate how far north that severe weather threat is going to extend. Earlier models, a few days ago, did not think that this warm front was going to make its way far north at all, farther inland at all. It was going to stay shunted down here to the south and really not advect northward until late in the period with this event. So overnight Wednesday into Thursday. That is not the case now. We have already seen this warm front extend inland and is expected to make some more inland progress as we go through the day today. Now, with all of this convective activity going on to the north of the warm front, that is going to keep this boundary shunted to the south for the next several hours. But as this clears, and we see some clearing back in here across East Texas and Louisiana between the batch to the west and this blob of rain out here across Mississippi and Alabama, once we see that convection clear to the north of the front, that will allow for some northward advance of this warm front. And again, wherever this warm front sets up, that is going to demarcate the northern boundary of our severe weather threat for today. And that is expected again to move somewhat significantly inland across portions of maybe central Louisiana to Mississippi and Alabama. But we'll have to watch to see where exactly that warm front sets up. All right, let's take a look at our upper air maps here. This is our 500 millibar map that is at present. Not a whole lot to see with this map, honestly. That is not something you usually say with a southeast event, but not a whole lot to see at this point. We just have this very, very broad trough out here across the western, really 2/3 of the country. Really mostly just broad southwesterly flow out ahead of this trough Not really any well-defined short waves within this flow. We do have a little bit of a ripple here out across the southeast. This is a lead shortwave that is associated with this precipitation, this area of precipitation out here across the southeast that is ongoing at this point. That is going to move off to the northeast and will not be a factor for today's setup. And instead, we're just going to have to rely on this broad southwesterly flow to get the job done, which can be difficult at times. We'll go down here to 700 millibars in just a second, but we really don't see any real well-defined exit region with this trough, not like we usually see with these southeast events. So that is one interesting feature with this event. Not something you often see with these southeast events, but we do have broad, large-scale forcing for ascent as this stronger flow with this rounding the base of this trough kind of glances this area here of the southeast today. That might provide enough ascent to initiate severe storms in this environment. And we'll also have our surface features as well. And given that we have strong surface heating, that is going to really bolster those low-level lapse rates, low-level instability, and help that instability get to a point where we can initiate robust storms in this environment. So very unique pattern for a southeast event. Synoptic scale forcing for ascent, not really all that intense at this point. And another thing, most of the forcing with this broad trough is going to remain somewhat north of the area of interest. Again, we said our warm front is going to be probably somewhere in here, central Louisiana, central Mississippi, central Alabama, and most of our strong flow is going to be relegated to the north of this boundary. So most of our forcing with this setup is going to be to the north, at least on the synoptic scale, to the north of the warm front. We're going to have to rely on those surface boundaries and surface features as well as warm advection to get the job done with this setup. Let's go up to 300 millibars here. Not much change here in our upper levels of the atmosphere. We see a little bit of diffluence aloft. These pink contours are your diffluence aloft, again, where those wind barbs spread apart in the upper levels of the atmosphere, creates a void. Mother Nature doesn't like that, so it brings up air from below to fill that void, and that's how you get large-scale rising motion in these severe weather events. We do see some of that right now associated with this lead shortwave. Again, that is expected to move off to the northeast today, and that is not going to be of really any impact on our afternoon round of severe storms with this setup. So synoptic scale forcing for ascent is on the weaker side today for sure. Let's take a look at 700 millibars, see if we can figure out any little short waves embedded within this flow. You see that lead shortwave here, a few little ripples in that flow over Arkansas down into Louisiana, into Mississippi and Alabama. Again, those move off to the northeast with time. We do see this little shortwave back in here, out across the West Texas region right now. And this may be our only hope here on the synoptic scale to get some forcing with this setup. Very subtle shortwave here, but you can see the little kinks in the height contours there. That will move off to the east as well as we go through the next several hours, probably positioning itself, if I had to guess, somewhere here in the Louisiana vicinity by mid to late afternoon today, and that is going to allow for perhaps some very subtle forcing for ascent in this environment to help things along, help organize those storms along the frontal boundary at the surface, as well as perhaps provide just enough synoptic scale forcing for ascent to initiate some warm sector convection out in here. That has been a concern over the last several days. Not really seeing a lot in the way of forcing mechanisms for warm sector supercells, but we've seen an uptrend in that, and confidence has increased a little bit in open warm sector supercell development with this setup. Could be in part to this little shortwave back in here moving into the region as we go into the afternoon hours. 850 millibars here. Not much to speak of. We have very strong cold air intrusion here to the north. You see these temperature lines, these isotherms. These blue contours are your colder air here, sub 0 degrees Celsius, and these are packed really tightly back in here to the north of this boundary. That indicates a very strong cold air intrusion here. Lots of cold air has seeped down here into the U.S. from Canada, and that's why we're getting a lot of winter weather on the backside of this system. Very tight temperature gradient here, and very cold air on the backside of this frontal zone. But we're going to see that countered by the strong warm advection here. Low-level jet across the coast at this point, already very strong, 40 to 45 knots out here from East Texas into Louisiana and Mississippi at this point. That likely will continue as we are expecting to see some low-level cyclogenesis going through the day as this broad trough aloft makes its way to the east. We will see some low-level cyclogenesis here across East Texas, and we've already seen some evidence of that ongoing this morning. And as that happens going into the afternoon, we should see at least some maintenance of this low-level jet and likely some increase in the low-level jet as we get into sunset and the nighttime hours. Here we are at the surface, and you see this little tongue of the isobars here across East Texas into the Arklatex region. That is the beginning of our surface low. We've seen a little bit of a surface low develop out here across this region that will continue to deepen ever so slightly going through the day because we don't have a real strong, tight, compact trough aloft to really focus that low-level cyclogenesis. We are not going to see real deep intense cyclogenesis out here across the Gulf Coast states today, but we will see some with that southwesterly flow aloft, cold frontal zone draped in this region. We will see that sort of frontal low develop and move along the frontal zone here and create that a little bit of a more defined warm front. And that cold front will be moving in from the west as well. Again, that should be our main initiating boundary for severe weather in this event, storms along the frontal boundary here. To better illustrate that, let's take a look at our raw surface data. So this is what our raw surface data shows right now, and you can see where that surface low is at the moment. You see some counterclockwise curvature here in the wind barbs across southeast Texas. Easterly winds across East Texas, Central Texas, more northerly flow, more southwesterly to westerly winds out there across the Texas Gulf Coast. And then as we get toward the Louisiana Texas border, more southerly flow. So a nice counterclockwise curvature here in the flow, which would place our surface low here perhaps just to the east of the College Station area, which is right in there. So surface low right in there. And again, all of this convection right now is going to keep our warm front shunted down to the south for now. Warm frontal zone looks to be right in here. Clear wind shift at this point. Easterly winds to the north, southerly winds to the south. Clear temperature gradient as well. 73 over 70 to the south there at Beaumont. 61 over 61 there at Jasper with 50s there across Louisiana. Cold frontal zone back to the west as well. Looks to be perhaps somewhere in here. Looks to be right in there. There's our wind shift. Northerly winds to the north, more southerly flow to the south. Temperature gradient as well. 70s to the south of that, 50s to the north. So our cold front looks to be somewhere in there. And again, that is going to, these are going to take shape a little bit better as we go into the afternoon hours. So we'll have to watch how that takes place. Again, we talked about this batch of convection that is ongoing across East Texas right now, well to the north of this surface low that is developing within this colder air. So all of this convection right now is elevated to the north of this warm sector. But as the surface low lifts to the north, we could see some development down on the southern end of that area of convection, allowing for those storms to become surface-based and perhaps produce an all hazards severe threat as we go into the afternoon. So let's take a look at our eastern sector here across the Gulf Coast states, and we have a fairly rich air mass to the south of that warm frontal boundary. I'll draw in our warm front here. You can see it's clearly located somewhere across the southern portions of the Gulf Coast states right now. Not a lot of inland advance at this point because of all that convection to the north, but again, that is expected to change as we go into the afternoon hours today. Robust air mass to the south, dew points in the upper 60s to low 70s out in here, so very rich moisture with temperatures already in the mid 70s, especially down here across southern Louisiana. That is a good sign here for a southeast severe weather event, as I always talk about thermodynamics being the important part with these southeast events, more so than it is on the plains, I think. We already have very robust moisture and very warm temperatures here. We don't have all of this cluttered convection out here in the warm sector early in the morning, which is what you often see with these southeast events that can thwart the overall main event going into the afternoon. Not the case so far with this warm sector. As it advances inland, we should see that clearing persist, and temperatures should get up into the low 80s perhaps at least going into the late morning and early afternoon, providing a very juicy air mass with these high dew points to support robust severe weather in this warm sector. All right, some soundings here. Let's take a look at the Lake Charles, Louisiana sounding here. Observed sounding at 12Z. Interesting looking thermodynamic profile here. We were a little bit to the north of the warm front at this point. It was probably still hugging the Gulf Coast down here, so probably just on the north side of the warm front as this was released this morning. Already some robust elevated instability here, a little bit of that surface inversion with the just north of the warm front. Very weak capping out here. That is one thing that has increased confidence in open warm sector convective development, is the fact that we have fairly limited capping here. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing as far as a storm chasing perspective in these southeast setups. The Pro here for storm chasing and for severe storms in the open warm sector is that we have a weak cap. So not much is going to hold back convective development in the open warm sector. A little bit of a warm nose up in here, but not much to speak of at all. Little one down there as well. But with continued heating in the warm sector and continued warm moist advection in the low to mid levels, that should continue to erode going into the afternoon. But it also could mean a lot of storms develop in the open warm sector, and things could get cluttered pretty quickly. With weak capping, that allows lots of updrafts to go up, fairly unimpeded, and so that could mean a lot of storms are going up in the open warm sector. So with fairly unfocused forcing for ascent here over the warm sector, that could allow for a lot of storms to go up and a lot of supercells to compete with each other. Although the chances for mature supercells have increased with this setup in the open warm sector, could be a lot of them, meaning some competition and destructive storm interference. So we'll have to watch that for sure. Confidence again has increased in open warm sector convective development, but there could be a lot of it, and that could lead to a lessening of the overall threat if we get more destructive storm interference and interactions in the open warm sector. But a fairly robust looking profile here. Nice steep lapse rates aloft here, couple layers of 7 to 7.5 plus degrees Celsius per kilometer lapse rates, which is very strong for a southeast event. Usually those are hanging out on the lower thresholds for severe weather. Your 5, 6 to maybe 7 degrees Celsius per kilometer. We're seeing in excess of that here with this Lake Charles sounding. So robust thermodynamic profile here with this setup. Elevated instability already in place, only expected to at least maintain itself, if not grow, going into the afternoon, especially with strong surface heating already ongoing in the warm sector to the south. Wind profiles already more than favorable here. Strong flow aloft has led to about 60 knots of effective bulk shear, very lengthy hodographs, and some solid low-level curvature as well. Low-level shear, only about a effective storm relative helicity, only at about 100, but that's because our effective inflow layer is only a portion of that low-level air mass. This is, again, an elevated sort of storm sounding here with that low-level inversion. So our effective inflow layer is elevated off the surface and only a very small portion right now of that low-level air mass. But overall, low-level helicity is pretty strong, 0 to 1 kilometer helicity in excess of 300 meters squared per second squared. And that, again, that should persist through the afternoon given the at least some attempt to maintain cyclogenesis in the low levels today. So that low-level jet should maintain itself going into the afternoon, providing strong low-level shear in this environment. Let's go over to Slidell, basically the New Orleans area. Much of the same here. Low-level inversion just north of the warm front at the time this was released. A little bit more of a warm nose up in here. So that is a little bit stronger capping out here to the east. That may hold things back a little bit, but really it's not all that much at all. And so I would expect that to erode going into the afternoon with continued warm moist advection in the low to mid levels. And at least the approach of the broad trough from the east should provide some semblance of lifting and cooling of this capping inversion. So again, fairly weakly capped air mass in the open warm sector, going to allow storms to fire pretty easily, but it could mean a lot of storms fire easily as well. Very similar hodograph, strong deep layer shear, strong low level shear, and so the environment's pretty set here for a significant severe weather event, and this is definitely uptrended in the past few days. All right, let's dive into some model data here. This is the 12Z NAM, hot off the press, initialized at 500 millibars as we see it here. Basically, we can see the features that we talked about earlier. Here's our little lead shortwave with that lead jet streak out in here across the southeast. Again, that is going to move off to the northeast today, not be of impact in our severe weather event later on. And we have just this broad troughing out across the western two-thirds of the country. Some strong westerly and southwesterly flow rounding the base of that, but again, not really a lot of robust shortwaves within this flow, at least at 500 millibars. We see as we go on into the afternoon, we see some southward dive of that stronger mid-level flow here, our strongest mid-level flow in the red colors here. And again, that is expected to be really to the north of our main area of interest. The warm front expected to be somewhere in central Louisiana to central Alabama. Most of the stronger flow with this setup is off to the north. Not a ton of synoptic scale forcing for ascent. And I didn't mention this earlier, but that can be sometimes a negative factor for allowing storms to persist in the open warm sector. You have the warm advection at the surface ahead of the developing surface low, strong flow with that low-level jet, allowing for that strong warm advection there, and that can be an initiating mechanism itself. But a lot of times you really need stronger forcing within the warm sector to allow for those supercells in the warm sector to persist and really become mature. We've seen that in some of the recent events here in the southeast. You just don't have a lot of forcing in the open warm sector to really help those supercells along, give them some extra oomph to persist. And so we do have that little shortwave at 700 millibars we pointed out, but is that going to be enough to really allow storms to persist in the open warm sector and really reach their ceiling? That remains to be seen, and that's one of the main lacks of confidence with this setup, is how warm sector storms will persist, although we have again seen an increase in the potential for open warm sector supercells with this environment. Trough shifts east with time. We see some stronger flow rounding the base of that trough into the southeast states going into the overnight hours and morning hours tomorrow, allowing that line to persist. Perhaps some low-end severe threat moving into Georgia, the Florida panhandle there tomorrow morning as the trough moves off to the east, and then we'll see this kind of get out of there, making way for our next system, which is on Saturday. We'll talk about that in a future video. The SPC has some robust risk areas out for Saturday at this point, but we'll focus on our event for now. Let's go up to 250 millibars here to see our upper level atmosphere. And again, not much change in the upper levels of the atmosphere between the 500 millibar level and our 250 millibar level. Not a ton of defluence aloft at all. We do have some stronger flow over the warm sector here at 250 millibars, so that could lead to some help as well. Not so much in the form of defluence aloft, the spreading apart of those wind vectors, but more so you can think of these stronger winds as kind of pushing stronger flow out from away from a region. That leaves a void. That could lead to some rising motion for severe storms. So some very subtle rising motion initiated by perhaps some stronger 300 millibar flow impinging upon the warm sector here. That could be enough to allow those storms to persist in the warm sector, but again, that is a little bit in question. Down here at 700 millibars, we see that lead shortwave, some stronger flow here, influenced by some of that convection that is ongoing out across the region at the moment. Then you see a little bit of that shortwave make its way through into the trailing shortwave, make its way into the region. East Texas here by 18Z, so this is at noon Central Standard Time today. That could be enough, a little bit of extra forcing here, but it is, again, on the subtle side, very subtle, large-scale forcing for ascent in this setup. Down at 850 millibars, we'll see that low-level jet persist into the afternoon. And here we go. So that 40 to 45 knot low-level jet there moving in off the Gulf. Expecting it to persist going into the afternoon hours today. And we see that certainly as we get a broad sort of cyclogenesis process to take place here out across the Midwest and Mid-South. To the southeast of that strong low-level flow maintains itself through the day, allowing those hotographs to maintain some strong curvature going into the afternoon. So we should maintain very strong low-level shear and deep layer shear to support supercells and organized convection with that significant tornado risk because of the persistence of this low-level jet. Should ramp up after dark as well, and you see that 50, 60 plus knots of flow here out across this region going into the overnight hours. That could lead to some strengthening of the convection overnight, increase in the overall damaging wind and tornado risk as it moves across Mississippi into Alabama, and any more discrete supercells out in the open warm sector that are able to reach their ceiling will be able to tap into this low-level jet and produce perhaps some strong tornadoes even going into the evening and nighttime hours tonight into early tomorrow morning. Surface data. Let's go ahead and take a look at our surface data, how that surface pattern progresses. I will zoom in here to our southern sector down at the surface here. And so there you go. You have your cold front, very strong cold frontal intrusion here, very cold air to the north of that. Temperatures in the single digits up there across Colorado and Kansas, 20s in Oklahoma this morning. With our warm sector, you can see exactly where that warm sector is. That warmest air really confined to the coastal region here at this point. But as that precipitation kind of decreases in intensity to the north of the front, that will allow that warm front to really push northward into the central portion of the Gulf Coast states. And we'll see this better on the overall dew point map, but you can see on our surface temperature map here, you see where that boundary is. Nicely lifts north, somewhat of an elongated surface low here, so not really a tight surface low that we often see in these southeast events. But we do have a surface low nonetheless, allowing that warm front to make its way northward. One thing of note here, it is a very sharp warm front, so our temperature gradient across the front is quite sharp. And sharp boundaries like this are not always all that favorable for tornadic supercells to really anchor on. So any storms near the warm front may tend to cross the boundary fairly quickly, but down here, plenty of warm sector to allow for some open warm sector development. Not a lot in the way of little convergence bands that are real well defined. Maybe we do see one here across southern Louisiana into southern Mississippi. Slightly more veered flow, south-southwesterly flow across Louisiana. Slightly more backed flow down there across southern Mississippi. So perhaps a very subtle confluence band setting up from southeast Louisiana northward into central Mississippi. Could be something to watch as well. We'll have to watch for any of those little confluence bands here in the open warm sector. But a very well-defined gradient here. Sharp warm front ahead of this surface low. Cold frontal zone back to the west. Again, that is going to be a main boundary for storms in this setup. So we'll have that band along the cold front. Very linear in nature given the pretty progressive nature of the cold front. Sharp temperature gradient across the front as well. And shear vectors fairly parallel to that frontal zone. If we take a look at our shear vectors there, you'll see here along the cold front fairly parallel to the actual boundary. So storms along the front should very quickly transition into a more linear mode. But out here in the open warm sector, we'll have to watch to see if any more discrete supercells can take place. Again, caveat with that is that very weak capping in the warm sector may allow for a lot of storms to go up despite the subtle forcing, and that could lead to some destructive storm interactions here. So very broad warm sector across pretty much central Louisiana, central Mississippi, central Alabama going into the afternoon hours today. Continues to pull northward going into the evening hours. You see that warm front actually makes it all the way up to northern Alabama, northern Mississippi. There are surface low right in there just to the west of the Huntsville area in Alabama. So lots of a warm sector there to work with. And we could see that severe threat persist well into the evening and nighttime hours tonight, with the width and breadth of the warm sector and the far northward advance of this warm sector could lead to a more long duration severe threat with this setup. All right, let's take a look at our moisture. Best moisture relegated well to the south right now. Not at all that surprising given the warm front is shunted to the south, but that again will quickly move northward as the surface low makes its way northward as well by 21Z, which is 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Pretty broad warm sector here. Cold front back in there, warm front well-defined gradient right in there with very rich moisture in the open warm sector. Upper 60s to low 70s dew points from central to southwest Louisiana all the way over into Alabama and the Florida Panhandle. So very long, broad warm sector, long duration severe threat could be on tap for today. Let's take some soundings here. We'll start at 18Z. As the moisture is still making its way northward, we'll take a look out here. We'll take one there at sort of the just west of the New Orleans area, and then one closer to the front there, Lake Charles, to see our open warm sector versus closer to the front. So this is out in the open warm sector, and this is why we've seen a pretty big uptick in the overall threat with this setup. Look at those instability profiles. Pretty robust instability profiles here. Quite fat cape profiles. And that was not something we saw a few days ago. We saw very skinny cape, very limited instability on the models. That has changed in spades here with this setup. Mixed layer cape in excess of 2,200 joules per kilogram. Very fat cape profiles. You see that very thick cape there, especially in the low levels. The NAM progging very thick low level cape. Not all that surprising as we already have surface heating ongoing in the warm sector, and that should continue. 240 meters square per 240 joules per kilogram of 0 to 3 kilometer cape there. That is upper echelon low level instability. So this is definitely uptrended big time. Low level wind profiles, not all that impressive. Not a ton of curvature in especially the lowest kilometer, that pink portion you see there, but plenty of curvature overall in the lowest few kilometers of that photograph. Not a ton of veering of the winds with height, given kind of southerly surface winds, slightly more southerly low-level jet as well. So not a ton of curvature in the low-level flow, but with this strong of low-level instability, if this is realized, even half of this is realized, that's going to be upper echelon for a southeast event. With adequate low-level shear, effective storm relative helicity in excess of 200 meters squared per second squared, that would be an environment favorable for tornadoes, perhaps a significant tornado or two. Again, this is at 18Z, so this is about midday. Back along the front, wind profiles are a little stronger there. A lot more curvature closer to the frontal zone. Instability is on the weaker side, interestingly, here. So looks like most of your instability, at least on the NAM depiction here, is going to be relegated to the open warm sector, which is a little bit concerning for your open warm sector supercell development. Could lead to very robust updrafts within the open warm sector, pending, of course, storm interactions as we talked about earlier. So very favorable profile for severe weather, including tornadoes, perhaps strong. Let's go to 21Z here. We'll take one again closer to the front, and then we'll take one here sort of in far southern Mississippi, right on the Louisiana-Mississippi border there, close to the Hattiesburg area, to give ourselves a look at the open warm sector. So here is our profile in closer to the front. We see better instability here as well. By this point, mixed layer CAPE in excess of 1600 joules per kilogram. Nice thick CAPE profile here, strong low-level instability, and some strong low-level shear as well. So that would certainly favor some embedded circulations within the line, as well as some damaging winds transported down to the surface within the line. Open warm sector, that is a scary profile. That is a very scary profile here. Again, this is uptrended massively over the last couple of days. This is, again, the open warm sector profile, Louisiana-Mississippi border, kind of near the Hattiesburg area of southern Mississippi. Very impressive instability profiles, 2200 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, very thick CAPE profiles as well, strong low-level instability. NAM showing, 250 joules per kilogram of 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE there. That is extremely impressive. Probably overdone, I will admit. The NAM tends to go a little bit crazy with those low-level instability values at times, but again, even if we see half of that realized, so about 120 joules per kilogram, that is on the higher end for southeast events, where you often see low-level lapse rates and low-level instability on the weaker side. Not the case with this setup, again, even if half of that low-level CAPE comes to fruition. Couple that with this wind profile. Extremely favorable wind profile for tornadoes, perhaps some strong, with strong low-level curvature there, strong veering and strengthening of the winds with height. Initially, those surface winds were a little bit veered out of the south-southwest. They looked to back with time a little bit in the open warm sector to more south-southeasterly, allowing for more veering and strengthening of the winds with height and allowing for more hodograph curvature. This is all in all favorable for a very potent tornado risk with this setup. Again, if we can get more discrete supercells to maintain themselves in this environment, which all signs point to that being the case, but storm interactions is really the only thing holding that warm sector back at this point from a really robust event. So this is at 21Z, so 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Here we are at 0Z. That warm sector continues to make its way to the north and northeast. Broad warm sector here. We'll take one from the open warm sector at this time. Southern Mississippi. That we maintain that very impressive profile. Instability a little bit weakens a little bit, but still not significantly enough to cause any hampering of the setup. But that wind profile certainly in the category of strong tornadoes with this much instability. So very impressive wind profiles here. And then we go into the overnight hours, 3Z, 6Z. That threat could continue into Alabama, open warm sector supercells, and storms along the line. We could see an uptick in intensity of those storms with the uptick in intensity of the low-level jet as well. And a little bit more limited instability, but we'll have all of those mature storms already ongoing in this environment. So not going to be too much of an issue, but that wind profile is still very strong, favorable for all severe hazards, damaging winds, and strong tornadoes. So that threat going to persist into the nighttime hours. And then we'll see that warm sector get pinched off eventually with time into the morning hours tomorrow. Low-end risk as we go into southeast Alabama, western Georgia, Florida Panhandle tomorrow with the line of storms. But the warm sector gets pinched, and therefore instability should be fairly weak and limited in scope there for severe storms going into tomorrow morning out there. Quick sounding here from Thursday morning. This is going to be at 7 a.m. Central, so 8 a.m. Eastern. Still favorable wind profiles. It's why SPC has kept a marginal risk out there, but instability profiles a little bit on the skinnier side, but still enough to support robust storms out in that area tomorrow morning. All right, so robust setup indeed. Let's take a look at what our cams are showing here. So this is the 12Z HRRR. It has that ongoing convection pretty nicely modeled there out across the Gulf Coast states. As we go forward in time, we see that warm sector really clear, not any convection really at all across the warm sector, a rarity for these southeast setups, but that is going to allow instability to build, especially low-level instability to set the stage for robust updrafts and supercells, both along the line and in the open warm sector. You see very linear storm mode along the cold front very quickly, not a lot of a window for discrete storms there, given the progressive nature of the front and shear vectors parallel to the cold front. And then by mid-afternoon or so, we start to see some beans develop in the open warm sector. So lots of little, you see these kind of kidney bean shapes in the open warm sector. That is a batch of open warm sector discrete supercells there. You see a lot of them though, a couple maybe different confluence bands here, quite a few storms out in the open warm sector. This one here is certainly the most robust, but I caution you on that one as it looks to be just north of the warm front. I'll take a sounding just out ahead of it. and you'll see that it is a little bit, actually, so this is a little different than the one I pulled earlier. This is definitely surface-based here, so that one would be of concern right along the warm frontal zone. Again, we talked about how sharp the temperature gradient is across that warm frontal zone, so not all that favorable for allowing storms to anchor on the actual warm frontal zone up in here, but we will have to watch any storms near that warm front could produce tornadoes up there. But of more concern is these ones that have a little bit more room in the open warm sector down in here. Lots of little kidney beans persisting into the afternoon. They strengthen by mid to late afternoon. This is at 23Z, so that is going to be 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. Lots of open warm sector supercells here. Lots of little kidney bean shapes there. Those would have the greatest threat to produce some strong tornadoes, given that we have that strong low-level jet in place and strengthening with time as we go into the late afternoon hours. Let me take a sounding here out ahead of this activity here across the kind of Mississippi, Alabama border. And that is certainly a favorable environment. Most mixed layer CAPE, almost 1,400 joules per kilogram. Not quite as strong as what the NAM was showing, but still more than adequate for robust supercells. And that wind profile, certainly favorable for robust supercells in the open warm sector. Strong low-level shear, strong deep layer shear, effective storm relative helicity at 350 meters squared per second squared. With that much instability and low-level instability you see, not even close to what the NAM was showing, but 100 joules per kilogram 3 CAPE is on the higher side for southeast events. So that will be plenty to allow for some effective tilting and stretching of any vorticity near the surface into the vertical to aid in tornadogenesis with these supercells in the open warm sector. So pretty robust look here from the HRRR. We continue on into the overnight hours. Those supercells persist, and then we get more of a line as we go farther and farther into the nighttime hours. And we get this just kind of the line as the main mode here as the warm sector gets pinched off tomorrow morning. So very robust look here from the HRRR supercell development there by 3 to 4 p.m. out there across Mississippi, southeast Louisiana, Alabama, and those will have the greatest threat for robust tornadic activity out in the open warm sector. WRF ARW model, let's take a look at that. So let's go ahead and see if it ever loads here. So all that precipitation north of the front, maybe not quite as widespread, but still fairly good depiction of the overall setup that we have ongoing this morning. Warm sector remains extremely clear of convection. Again, a rarity in southeast setups that's going to allow that warm sector to bake and really be ready for the taking for any storms that develop in the open warm sector. So quick line of storms there. You see kind of these bowing segments, these linear segments there. Quick transition to a line out along the cold front. And then as we go into mid-afternoon, we see some development out here in the open warm sector. So that will be of concern. And you see those become pretty robust pretty quickly. These ones, again, going to be right along the warm front. I question, again, whether those will be able to really root themselves to the warm front, given the very strong temperature gradient across the frontal boundary. But these storms down here in southern Mississippi to southwest Alabama may have the greatest threat, greatest warm sector to work with for robust tornadic activity. Not as much of a prolonged open warm sector supercell threat there, just a few hours before things really transition into more of the line back to the west. Very strong line of storms could pose some damaging wind risks, embedded tornado risk as well, and that persists into tomorrow morning. So not quite as potent as a setup that is what the HRRR was showing, but still potent nonetheless. NSSL WRF model. This is the final cam we will look at here in this setup. And so let's go ahead and see if it loads. So here we go with the NSSL WRF model. Here in the morning, not as widespread of convection at all. So this is definitely a thing that might make you take this particular run with a grain of salt. Not very widespread convection, not nearly as widespread of convection as what was ongoing this morning that was observed. That moves off to the north. We get that to fill in somewhat, but warm sector free and clear of convection. Early on, 1920Z, so that's 1 to 2 p.m. We start to get these beans in the open warm sector down there, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama. And those become, pretty amazing. You can see the supercell shapes in these kidney bean shapes. These would pose that all hazards risk, including the threat for significant tornadoes. A little bit farther east than maybe what the SPC was expecting here. I wouldn't be surprised if they shifted this maybe a little bit farther north and northeast in the next outlook. But this particular run, very potent look here with those discrete supercells tracking through the warm sector. And then as we go into the overnight hours tonight, those storms along the line take over as well. So the cams are pretty much on board Interesting here, we see tomorrow morning a little bit of a confluence band coming off the Gulf out here into the Florida Panhandle on this model run. We'll have to watch that. The warm sector does get pinched off with time, so we will have to, there might not be enough room for prefrontal supercells, but if there is, this particular model run is showing a perhaps confluence band developing there with some supercells moving into the Florida Panhandle area tomorrow morning, 5, 6, 7, 8 a.m. before the line moves through. So something to watch there, but the cams are pretty much all on board with this setup. Robust line to the west and the threat for open warm sector supercells, especially across Mississippi and Alabama, going into the afternoon hours today. So that is the situation for this setup. Potent setup is on the way for today. Things have again uptrended very much with this setup. What was once expected to be a low-end severe threat with not much activity in the open warm sector has trended to a setup where we are seeing a pretty good chance for open warm sector supercells that could produce a strong tornado or two. SPC for now has this enhanced risk level 3 out of 5 in the orange shaded region there. So far southeast Louisiana, southern Mississippi, southern Alabama. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if they move this a little bit farther north in subsequent outlooks, given what some of the cams are showing. Surrounded by a slight risk and marginal risk there across the Gulf Coast states. The reason here, mainly tornadoes and damaging wind. Threat for significant tornadoes is certainly there in the yellow stippled region, 10% hatched area for tornadoes, perhaps some strong, with a 2 and 5% area surrounding that. And then damaging winds there in the 30% region, the red shading there is where our damaging wind risk is going to be highest, especially with that line as it moves through in the evening and nighttime hours tonight. So folks here in these regions, definitely keep those weather radios handy, have multiple sources of weather information. This looks to be a pretty potent setup there out in the open warm sector. Question is, will those storms persist in the open warm sector? The models seem to think they will, but we do have some competing factors at play. Namely, will we have enough forcing to really allow those storms to persist? The cams certainly think so, so it could be a potent setup there. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.